Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns.
Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton with episode 187. And we're going to do this on the regular now. Check in on Kim's fat loss phase. All right, so we had one episode where it talked about, where my head was at, why I felt like I was ready to enter a new fat loss phase. I mentioned a few things that I was planning on using, a certain number of times going to the gym, using a calorie deficit, that kind of stuff. But I thought, okay, well, let's get kind of a lay of the land. Where's my brain at? What's going on? What are my goals? And then we'll check in on this on a regular basis. And if you can't tell by the way I'm talking right now, I don't have video on right now. My hands are waving in the air a lot. Can you tell from my voice? Anyway, so some thoughts. First of all, I'm going to say that I might say things in like one episode, like last time I laid some stuff out, and then I might in a later episode say something there like, that's a little different than what she said last time, because sometimes I change certain details as I go, and I don't always re-listen to what I did before, right? So it's an evolving process to be in a fat loss phase. I take things, I see how things are going. I might modify some things. So I just wanted to say, don't get confused if I say something that's a little different than I said before, because it's a journey and things might shift slightly. All right. So one thing I was thinking about recently that's kind of interesting and was not planned at all, but I've basically had what I would call two successful fat loss phases. Now, phase can mean different things, but if I look back in my history, since I went keto originally 6 years ago, what year is it? The older I get, the more I'm like, I don't know what year is this? Anyway, 7 years ago. Anyway, so in the first 2 years of my keto experience, I lost a total of around 65, 70 pounds. It was about 70 pounds. Why it's a little loosey-goosey. Then there's always some fluctuation, and then in periods where I'm maintaining or maybe gaining a little weight, you're like, do I stop it there? Do I subtract? Anyway, in the first 2 years, I lost about 70 pounds. We'll go with that. And then I hit a major stall. Things weren't moving. Things weren't going anywhere. I was struggling, major crisis. Learned some things, learned how to get unstuck, and applied those concepts to myself. And then I lost on my next phase about 35 pounds. And that was awesome. Maintained that. So at that point, I was like, oh, I've lost over 100 pounds. This is amazing. I feel great. I weigh less than I thought I would, in my adult life. And in my head, I was like, I would like to be a little smaller, but being a little smaller is more challenging than I want to. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. I'm not metabolically blessed in today's society, modern society, since the 50s, the body stuff. If I were living in a time where Rubenesque goddesses were popular, I have the perfect metabolism. But I am somebody who confuses, I've had metabolic tests done and they're like, how is that possible? Is it broken? The machine might be broken. We don't know, but we don't understand. Anyway, so I have scientific data that says I'm just a little screwed in the, if you like food categories to body size categories. And so there's this place where you're like, okay, I can maintain this. I can feel good about this. Would I like to be smaller? Yes. Am I willing to do what it's going to take to be smaller? Probably not. There's a certain reality there, right? And so that's kind of where I stayed for a while. And I was, good with that. But over time, I have, said maybe I'm not good with that. There's been a lot of back and forthing in the mind. And I just hit this point over the last few months where I'm like, yeah, I'm not good with that. I think I'm ready for a new challenge. And I think the time in between these phases, which generally I think can often feel a little torturous, have been crucial for me. The time in between where I'm either maintaining or maybe struggling or I'm working, you know, I've never been somebody who maintained a healthy weight or, I've always been gaining, 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 gaining. And so these breaks in between, I think they've been really good for me. They've been growth times, not physical, but mental growth times, where I'm like, oh, okay, let's really assess what's going on. And so, anyway, so first phase, I lost about 70 pounds. Second phase, I lost about 35 pounds. Now I'm coming into this last phase and thinking, what is my goal here? What would I like to see the scale go to? And I'm realizing, oh, I have about 18 pounds I'd like to lose, which, okay, math nerds, have you put it together yet? I figured out that each one is half of the last one. 18 pounds is about half of 35. 35 is about half of 70. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if it means anything. Anyway, so that's where we're at. That's my goal, to see the scale about 18 pounds lower. And why am I not sharing my actual weights, which might make this a little easier? The reality is I live in a social media climate and people can be really cruel. And I don't necessarily want to put that out there right now. I might in the future, but I'm knowing my boundaries. And the other reason that I don't necessarily say it is, I don't know if you've ever found out somebody's weight and thought, really? I had no idea, right? Because we're all individual. We're all unique. We are all in different bodies, different metabolisms, different everything. And so I don't always share exactly my caloric number, right? Because I see so often, as soon as you say you're doing, what are your macros? What are your macros? How much did you lose? How tall are you? It's like, I get that we all want to compare, but it's not always helpful. It's often harmful. And so sometimes I intentionally exclude giving specific details because I don't necessarily want you to apply things to yourself in mirroring exactly what I'm doing, but instead learn from what I'm doing and apply it to your own circumstances. Okay. So just putting that out there. So what are some of the things that I've had to look at? One of the questions I've always asked myself, is the juice worth the squeeze? When I ended my last fat loss phase, I was like, I have reached a point at which the juice is not worth the squeeze to go further here. I didn't have that desire in me, when you're weighing the cost to benefit analysis. And now I'm like, I think my scale is tipping towards benefit. Also, there was a place where my brain was with food where I was like, I think I could use a different challenge right now, stability wise, life wise. And so these are things that I take into account. And in terms of what someone else might look at, I just want to say, until you can say to yourself, it's okay to be where I'm comfortable, I think there's work to be done there. Yes, we need to work on our health. We need to work on our insulin resistance. We need to work on being as long living as we can, as healthy as we can, our lifespan, our health span. Having a little extra padding around the edges doesn't really impact that. And so being really honest with yourself about your motives, what you're looking for. And for me, I'm like, I think I want to feel challenged right now. I want to feel create a challenge in my life that feels good, not sometimes challenges don't feel good. This one, I'm like, I feel good about this challenge. I'm going into it with my eyes open. I want to confront some of the things that I'm doing based on habit or comfort that could be based on, self-improvement and consciousness. Will I only be successful if I lose exactly 18 pounds, which is sort of the goal I have in mind? No, I'm not putting that on myself, but I am saying hey, I want to know where I'd like to get to. What's my potential destination so that I can say, how am I doing compared to that? Do I have a deadline? I do not. Will I potentially take some maintenance breaks in there, coming back up to my maintenance calories? Yes, I probably will. I think that those can be very useful and helpful, and there might be weeks, months, days, whatever word that is, the trade-off I want to consciously make. And what will I do when I feel discouraged? Because I will feel discouraged. It's just a reality. My brain will feel discouraged at some point. And I will need a strategy for that. So, what am I going to do there? And what I've learned over time is it's a lot about focusing on, for me, focusing on the data, drilling down into the data. What's going on here? What's going on there? Running an experiment. What happens if I do X, Y, or Z? Like, what happens if I start monitoring my blood sugar again? Will that make it? What happens if I change my macros up? What will happen there? So these are things. What are some of the tools I'm going to use on my journey? Well, the first one is macro tracking, obviously, and caloric tracking in that they're connected in my mind, though you don't always have to think about them in the same way, but your macros add up to your calories, right? It's the data about the food. And I'm using an app. Now, I often recommend to people Chronometer, which I think is a phenomenal app. I really like Chronometer for a lot of reasons, and I will continue to use it in programs. One of the reasons is it's a little easier to share. It has a screen interface on the laptop. I can put recipes in, things like that, a little easier. However, the app I personally use for macro tracking at this point for myself is called Macro Factor. I have an affiliate code. I'll put it in the link if you want. Let me tell you about the difference between Macro Factor and Chronometer. Again, I think Chronometer is great, and I still use it for certain things like calculating recipes and that sort of thing. So there's nothing wrong with it at all. What's different about Macro Factor is Macro Factor has a built-in coach. What do I mean by that? Well, what it does, coach is perhaps, they use that word, but Macro Factor has within it the technology to track your food intake, right? Now, obviously, garbage in, garbage out, right? You have to put all the data in there correctly. You have to tell it exactly what you ate, but it tracks it and it compares it to your expected daily energy needs, and it changes its recommendations. So if you tell Macro Factor, hey, I want to lose a pound a week, and it sees that you are or aren't losing a pound a week, based on what you want to happen, it will change your macro recommendations. And so I'm using this app to help guide me on my choices. Now, I know how to make those macro changes. Like if I were using Chronometer, I've always just done it mathematically, and I tell it what to do. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm seeing. I need to change my macros to X, Y, or Z, right? So I have to manually do that. Whereas Macro Factor is doing the math for me and making those changes just automatically. It's like every week it's like, hey, check in. I check in and it says, have this instead or move over here. Just these are our recommended changes in macros. And so that's what I'm using because it kind of takes the thinking out of it for me. And while I'm happy to do these kinds of changes for a client and for myself, like it's functionally useful to have some app that will help me with it. And I've been testing this app and it's very useful. And so I'm using Macro Factor. Why I don't use it in terms of like just for everything and why I still like Chronometer. Well, Macro Factor doesn't have an interface on my laptop. It's only an app. So I find it harder for me to I use my Chronometer for cataloging my recipes and things like that. So it's a little easier for me to do recipe stuff in Chronometer. And I still think Chronometer is a very useful app. Now I'm just rambling. Sorry. But I am using Macro Factor at this time for my macro tracking and adjustments. I've thought about doing like a Macro Factor class, like a free little video class. Anyway, if you're interested in that, let me know. If any of you is interested in trying it out. All right. What are my macros? Some of you have asked. And I don't know that my macros are super helpful for people because obviously, as I've said, we are not exactly the same, but I will tell you, my first round of weight loss was highly ketogenic. So that first 70 pounds, I was in ketosis the whole time. I was eating, my goal was under 20 grams of total carbs a day. My second round was higher protein, lower carb, and less fat. So, my average macros, they changed a little bit over time, but you'd be looking at something more like my first round. It was probably like, off the top of my head, it was around 70 grams of protein, maybe 150 grams of fat, and 20 grams of carbs, somewhere in there. My next round was more like 120 to 140 grams. So let's call it 130 grams of protein, maybe like 50 grams of carbs, and fat was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 60 grams, somewhere on there, right? So what am I doing now? I have found that, in my opinion, the more metabolically healthy you become, the more carb tolerant you often are. So there's a reason why I did better on a little bit more carbs and a little less fat when I became more metabolically healthy. I'm now very metabolically healthy, comparatively speaking. So I'm not going back to keto. I'm still doing a little more carbs, around the neighborhood of 50. Honestly, I don't really worry about going over that if they're primarily from whole food, non-grain sources. So fruits and vegetables, mostly vegetables, right? And my protein it looks about like it did in my last round, which is a higher protein, moderate carb, moderate fat approach. It works best for my body at this time, works great for my digestion, my energy, my mental state. Am I willing to change that up? Sure. At some point, if I want to run some experiments, doing some other things, I will. But for me, very much about the way you do your macros is very tied to your metabolic state. If you're very insulin resistant, type 2 diabetic, you have metabolic syndrome, I believe my personal opinion is lower the carb, a little bit higher fat is probably a better idea. And as you become more metabolically flexible, more metabolically healthy, you have choice. Somebody might be like, I love keto. I want to stay keto. I want to keep the fats higher. I don't think that's detrimental. I think you have to go based on how your body responds to the way that you're eating. And what ended up happening, why I made the change, is when I went in my second round of fat loss, I found where keto wasn't satiating me anymore. I was too hungry. And this is not true of everybody, but this can be true of people as they become more metabolically healthy. They might need to make macro shifts. And so that's what I did. But my body is not your body, and we all are going to feel different. And I am a big proponent of experimentation to see what works for you. And those are the way that I'm planning to lay out this phase, using my macro tracker, going into the season, right? I've used Macro Factor for several months, and that's what I would recommend, right? If you're going to use this app, it's the only one there's another one that's similar, but Macro Factor is unique in that it looks at how you're eating, what you're eating, and then makes adjustments, whether you hit goals or didn't hit goals. If you're like, oh, I meant to lose weight, but I gained weight, as long as you tracked your food accurately, it will help you figure out what to do next. And so I'm not trying to take away from the coaching that I do, which is very different. It's not just macros. But anyway, so Macro Factor is a unique tool, but it works best if you track your food accurately for several weeks to months before you enter the phase you're going into. You could track as you go, but it's going to be a lot more guess and check at that point. So, that's what I'm going to be doing in this next round. Oh, what rate of loss am I targeting? About 1/2 to 3/4 of a pound a week. Again, because I think that pushing things a little too hard and fast can lead to disaster. And I am built for distance, not speed. And so we're going to go with a modest rate of loss in this phase. Going into the holiday season, what am I making my food choices around to be workable in terms of my macros and my caloric needs? I'm doing a lot of things with yogurt. Yogurt is my friend, cottage cheese as well. I can say this past week, I've made some really great meals like stir fries with cauliflower rice. I've done several casseroles with eggs, Greek yogurt. I made like a breakfast yogurt. I don't know what to call it. So it's not flan. That would be insulting to flan eaters, but it's kind of in that genre. It's pumpkin, yogurt, eggs, and a little bit of protein powder, and it makes sort of like a custard loaf. And I've been doing that for breakfast. I've been doing some protein focaccia for breakfast. I made a cheesy mushroom bake for lunch. I've had a few times. I've also been doing sandwiches like with my focaccia as the bread. And so I'm just keeping it fairly simple, stay into my macros, tracking very carefully, not letting myself get into any rounding errors. And so far, so good. I will update you on my progress as we go. And I hope this was not too much of a ramble, but a lot of people like to know how things are going. And so I'm going to try and do monthly-ish check-ins as we dive into this exciting season. All right, guys, I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.